All right, everyone. Hello and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is the 1st of March, and I will be taking a look at Mercury conjunct Neptune and the North Node in Pisces. Now, I figured I would do this as an animation on my computer, and I am looking at this software called SolarFire because I figured rather than just spending a long time going on a kind of a philosophical diatribe or a kind of a deep dive into the archetypes, instead I'm going to show you the interesting specifics about this particular transit, namely that we're talking about the motions of two particular planets in conjunction with each other. And what makes this interesting is that we're going to be basically getting two of these in sequential order in different signs. In um, the last decan of Pisces, which, if you use the system where you associate the decans of each sign is split into three subdivisions, where each of these is associated with one of the 36 pip cards in tarot. This would make the current conjunction happening at the decan associated with the Ten of Cups, known as the Lord of Satiety. And I have there's this kind of idea of that there's this idea of the if you use Aries as the last, or the Aries as the first sign of the zodiac, if you have an astrological new year starting at Aries, starting in spring, starting at the spring equinox, then there's this idea that Pisces as the last sign of the zodiac, there's a kind of this point of the zodiac is associated with the sense of sadness that comes from things coming to an end, the sort of the final moment kind of thing, and it's contrasted by in Aries a kind of new beginning, a new start. And the first decan of Aries, of course, being associated with the Two of Wands, which is also sometimes, I know Austin Coppock calls it the battle axe decan, or in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, it shows a guy gazing at a globe, uh, perhaps with visions of a conqueror or something like that. So there's this kind of, and Aries, of course, being associated with the Emperor card, being a Mars ruled sign. There's also interesting because both the last decan of Pisces and the first decan of Aries are considered to be Mars decans. So there's this kind of like this thing that comes at the beginning and this thing that comes at the ending. And there's also, which is interesting, is that there's this kind of sense of there's this idea of like the the 10 of cups being like a kind of like the idea of a sadness that comes upon completion, like having ingested a big meal, and then you feel as you're trying to, like, usually people have a dessert at the end to give them a pick me up, because if you didn't have the dessert you would feel kind of sad and moody as you are full and satiated, right? That's where the word satiety comes from, this sort of fullness of, now my heart is full and I'm sad, and sometimes you may be reading a book and you are procrastinating finishing the book because you're enjoying it, and you are kind of sad to finish, even though you enjoyed it. It was a good book. You are now sad that you came to the end of it, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. Once you finish your cake, you can't eat it anymore. So these are the kinds of themes that I associate with Mercury conjunct Neptune at the end of Pisces here. There is something also to consider, that Mercury is badly debilitated in Pisces. Mercury has just come out of this conjunction with Saturn. there is certain emotional moodiness around all this. There's also the North Node conjunct Mercury right now, which is there's a certain hunger, right? There's a certain craving for more. There's a certain kind of like this idea of satiety, being full, not wanting anymore, being complete, but being kind of sad and coming to the end. But there's a sort of hunger for more somehow in the midst of all this that's driving more and more and more, but also this maybe that caught between the Saturn with a kind of a sense of winding things down, of restricting or being on a budget or something, right? Or having a limit or something. But then there's this kind of the Neptune, maybe there's a wanting to like retail therapy, or maybe just even just therapy itself, or somehow it's at some level wanting to spend or give, or in order to somehow but like the sadness itself is kind of like the sadness at the end of the meal and you're only spending on dessert, which could be extra calories perhaps, like stuff. So this is kind of where I'm. So anyway, what's interesting about this is that if we see what's happening with Mercury, in just tomorrow, Mercury is conjunct Neptune perfectly. The day after, Mercury enters into Aries. And as we follow along here, Venus is already retrograde. My last video, I was talking about Venus stationing retrograde. And then you'll see here is you'll have Mercury and Venus both conjunct in Aries on the 11th of March. Mercury progresses along until it slows down at the 9th degree. So just at the end of the second decan, it slows down and stations retrograde. And then so now you have Mercury and Aries both retrograde in the second decan of Aries. Then you have the Sun making this retrograde Cazimi with Venus on the 22nd of March. You have the Sun making a retrograde Cazimi with Mercury on the 24th of March. And then you have both Venus and Mercury going back into Pisces at the same time as Neptune ingresses into Aries. So now you have Neptune in Aries for the first time here in 2025, which is a big transit. And particularly for me, it's interesting because when Uranus entered Aries in 2011, Uranus is known for big shocks, right? It's like the shocking, disruptive planet. And when that happened, we associate that with the big earthquake that happened in Japan that caused the Fukushima disaster. And Neptune is a completely different planet. So I don't know if I would necessarily expect earthquakes, but perhaps something at sea, perhaps some kind of, often there's a naval thing associated with Neptune, or it could also do with certain, Neptune's also associated with certain religious or ideological beliefs or things like that. And it's also, interestingly, Canada's Neptune return, because Canada, the nation of Canada, if you look at Canada's national chart, I did a video on this recently, Canada has Neptune in Aries, so Canada is going to be going through a Neptune return. But that's more when Neptune's in the middle of Aries. So we're going to be a few years out from that being exactly, the Neptune return. So anyway, so Mercury, as Neptune goes into Aries, Mercury in retrograde motion is heading back into Pisces and eventually stations direct, basically conjunct the North Node only by 1 degree on the 6th of April. And then Mercury in forward motion makes another ingress into Aries and is now we have the second Mercury Neptune conjunction at the 0-0, the point of the equinox. And this is going to be the second Mercury Neptune conjunction. Similar dynamics, similar proximity to the North Node, but it's going to be happening in the sign of Aries rather than the sign of Pisces. And this is particularly interesting because it's the 0 degree of Aries. And what the whole idea about this is that there's a certain kind of contention, or rather, what kind of version of the zodiac that you use, whether you use tropical or sidereal or whatever. And most of this contention is based on the idea that the 00 Aries point is known to drift, which is being like, if you take this point of when the sun is at this point, when the sun is at 00 Aries, it's the spring equinox, right? And that is a very unambiguous thing, because the spring equinox is when we have equal amounts of light and darkness, and then we tip into the spring, then we start getting more light than darkness, right? So it's a very unambiguous thing, and the tropical astrology keeps the 00 Aries point to that equilibrium, that balance between light and darkness, and bases the whole zodiac subdivisions off of that rather than the constellations, right? And the sidereal zodiac basically just adjusts this so that the 00 Aries point is going to be a sign off, right? But there are still, so it's kind of interesting to basically see, if you're using tropical, if you're using sidereal, the signs would be different, but you could still agree on the planetary conjunctions, right? This is kind of just like perhaps an excessive amount of detail, but it's interesting because I think it's interesting to go into, because the 00 Aries point is the point where we mark off the beginning of the zodiac. If you're using Aries as the first sign, and that this is where the whole idea of the precession of the equinoxes, it all revolves around this point. And the basic idea is that the age of Aquarius is supposed to officially begin when this 00 is Aries point matches up with the constellation of Aquarius rather than the constellation of Aries or Pisces. The idea is that if you were using the sidereal zodiac corrects for this, so that the 00 Aries point is actually somewhere in Pisces. So it's, I'm not using sidereal, I'm using tropical. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a certain degree of subjectivity, or some kind of cultural bias or cultural preference in the meaning of a Mercury-Neptune conjunction happening in one sign versus the other. But it's going to be interesting, because now we get the chance to see what's the difference between Mercury-Neptune conjunct in Pisces, which is happening right now as I make this video, versus Mercury-Neptune conjunct in Aries, just a few degrees over, but at the very beginning of the next sign, at this which still holds a lot of resonant value, because it's this equilibrium between light and darkness and the beginning of spring and the right. So there's this. I'm just thinking this is going to be interesting, because we have a movement of Mercury, a movement of Venus going back and forth across this area, which itself is going to be the focus of a lot of the intensity. If you have any planets, any placements, either in the late degrees of mutable signs or the early degrees of cardinal signs, then this year is going to be a tremendous astrological year, because of all this action that's happening in these two decans, the very last decan of the zodiac and the very first decan of the zodiac, if you use tropical, and if you use Aries as the first. And so we're going to have Venus conjunct Neptune to follow up. And we also have this Chiron in Aries. We're going to get a Mercury conjunct Chiron later too. But then we're heading into May. I'm maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself, right? But this is it's not going to be until, let's see here, the end of May, that we get Saturn entering Aries, and we have this Neptune Saturn conjunction in the first degree of Aries, which is the big transit of the year. And so what we're having right now is we're entering the kind of the pre-game, the preamble to the year's biggest transit at this particular corner of the zodiac where the solstice, or not the solstice, the equinox, the spring equinox point is going to be lit up by all kinds of transits. We're also going to be having Jupiter in Cancer, an exalted Jupiter squaring this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is also an interesting aspect to watch for. Check back for more on that later. Thank you for watching Dan's Astrology.